You know what's wild? 14 men sat around a table in Berlin for 3 months in 1884, drew some lines on a map with rulers, and completely changed the lives of over 400 million people who weren't even in the room. No African leaders were invited. No African voices were heard. Just European men with cigars and champagne, casually dividing up an entire continent like it was a cake at a birthday party. And here's the thing that'll blow your mind. Over 90% of Africa was still governed by African kingdoms and communities before this meeting. 3 months later, almost the entire continent was claimed by Europe. This is the story of how the Berlin Conference didn't just redraw maps, it rewrote destinies, destroyed civilizations, and created problems that Africa is still dealing with today, over 140 years later. Picture this. It's November 15th, 1884, in a grand palace in Berlin. Crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceiling, mahogany tables polished to perfection, and portraits of European royalty staring down at the proceedings. Representatives from 14 countries are gathering: Germany, Britain, France, Portugal, Belgium, Spain, Italy, and several others. They're all dressed in their finest suits, shaking hands, exchanging pleasantries. The host? Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor of Germany, a man known for his cunning political strategies and his thick mustache that looked like it had its own personality. But let's be clear about something. This wasn't called Let's Colonize Africa Conference. Oh no, they were way more clever than that. The official name was the Conference on the Affairs of Central Africa, and they claimed it was about promoting trade, ending slavery, and bringing civilization to the so-called Dark Continent. Sounds noble, right? Wrong. This was basically a gentleman's agreement on how to steal an entire continent without going to war with each other over the loot. Now, you might be wondering, why did this conference even happen? Well, by the 1880s, European powers had been nibbling at Africa's coastlines for centuries, setting up trading posts, making deals with local leaders, that sort of thing. But the interior? That was still largely unmapped by Europeans and controlled by powerful African kingdoms like the Ashanti, the Zulu, the Ethiopian Empire, and countless others. Then something changed. The Industrial Revolution kicked into high gear, and suddenly Europe needed raw materials desperately. Rubber for tires, ivory for piano keys and billiard balls, copper for electrical wiring, diamonds and gold for, well, being rich. Africa had all of this in abundance. King Leopold II of Belgium was particularly greedy. This guy had been eyeing the Congo Basin like a kid staring at a candy store. He hired the explorer Henry Morton Stanley, yes, the Dr. Livingstone, I presume guy, to go into Central Africa and make treaties with local chiefs. But here's the trick. These chiefs thought they were signing trade agreements. They had no idea they were supposedly signing away their sovereignty. Leopold wasn't even representing Belgium officially. He set up a fake organization called the International African Association, pretending it was a humanitarian and scientific group. In reality, it was his personal business venture to extract wealth from Congo.
Other European powers noticed what Leopold was doing and thought, hey, we want a piece of this too. France was expanding in West Africa, Britain had interests in East and Southern Africa, Portugal claimed ancient rights to Angola and Mozambique based on, get this, the fact that their explorers had sailed past those coasts 400 years earlier. Germany, newly unified and late to the colonization game, wanted colonies to prove it was a major power. Tensions were rising. There were disputes over territories. Wars between European powers seemed possible. And that's when Bismarck stepped in with a brilliant, if deeply cynical, solution. Let's all sit down and agree on the rules for taking Africa, he essentially said. That way we can carve it up peacefully, among ourselves, of course. So what actually happened at this conference? For 3 months, these diplomats negotiated and debated. They established rules that sound reasonable until you think about them for 2 seconds. Rule number 1. Any European power that occupied African territory had to notify the others, basically calling dibs in a formal way. Rule number 2, they had to establish effective occupation, meaning you couldn't just plant a flag on a beach and claim the whole interior. You had to actually have troops or administrators there. This rule, by the way, launched what historians called the Scramble for Africa, a frantic race where European powers rushed to occupy as much land as possible before their rivals could. Rule number 3, and this is darkly hilarious, they had freedom of trade and navigation on the Congo and Niger rivers. Freedom for Europeans, that is. The African people who lived along those rivers for generations, their opinions didn't matter. The conference also created the Congo Free State, which sounds nice until you realize it was Leopold's personal property, not Belgium's, his personal colony. Like owning a farm, except this farm was 905,000 square miles and filled with millions of people who were about to experience one of history's worst atrocities. Here's what gets me. Not a single African representative was at this conference. Not one. Imagine having a meeting about dividing up someone's house while they're still living in it and not inviting them to the discussion. The closest any African got to participating was an African-American journalist named Henry Sylvester Williams, who later protested the conference's decisions, but that was years later. At the actual conference, complete African exclusion. The consequences were catastrophic and immediate. Within 20 years of the Berlin Conference, almost all of Africa was under European control. Only 2 countries remained fully independent: Ethiopia, which defeated Italy in battle, and Liberia, which was protected by American interests. Everything else, colonized. And here's the really messed up part. The borders these Europeans drew made absolutely no sense. They used straight lines and rivers as boundaries, completely ignoring the ethnic, linguistic, and cultural realities on the ground. Let me give you an example. The Bakongo people, who had their own kingdom for centuries, suddenly found themselves split between 3 different colonies: French Congo, Belgian Congo, and Portuguese Angola. Imagine waking up one day and being told that your family on the other side of the river now belongs to a different country with different laws, and you need permission to visit them. This happened to millions of people.
Or take Nigeria. The British lumped together over 250 ethnic groups with different languages, religions, and traditional governance systems into one colony. They didn't ask these groups if they wanted to be together. They just drew a line on a map and said, "You're all Nigerians now. Figure it out." And we wonder why there have been ethnic conflicts in these regions. The seeds were planted in Berlin in 1884. The human cost of what followed the Berlin Conference is almost impossible to comprehend. In the Congo Free State, Leopold's private militia forced people to harvest rubber under a quota system so brutal that historians estimate between 5 to 10 million Congolese died from violence, starvation, exhaustion, and disease. Workers who didn't meet their rubber quotas had their hands cut off as punishment. Entire villages were wiped out. This wasn't civilization. This was systematic exploitation and murder, all dressed up in the language of progress and development. Across Africa, colonial powers used forced labor, imposed taxes that required Africans to work for Europeans to pay them, seized the best agricultural land for European settlers, and destroyed traditional governance systems that had maintained order for centuries. Educational systems were designed not to empower Africans, but to create just enough clerks and administrators to help run the colonial system. Resources were extracted and shipped to Europe while very little was invested back into African infrastructure or industries. And the psychological impact? Colonizers promoted the idea that African cultures, religions, and ways of life were primitive and inferior, that European civilization was the pinnacle of human achievement, and Africans should be grateful for being colonized. Generations grew up being told their own heritage was worthless. That damage doesn't disappear just because colonialism officially ends. Speaking of which, most African countries didn't gain independence until the 1960s, a full 80 years after the Berlin Conference. And when they did gain independence, they inherited those nonsensical borders drawn by Europeans, economies designed to serve European industries, not African development, and political systems imposed from outside rather than grown from African traditions. Is it any wonder that the transition to independence was rocky in many places?
Today, over 140 years later, the ghost of the Berlin Conference still haunts Africa. Those arbitrary borders remain largely unchanged, contributing to ethnic tensions and conflicts. The extractive economic model, where Africa exports raw materials and imports finished goods, continues in many countries. The psychological impact of being told your culture is inferior for generations doesn't vanish overnight, and former colonial powers still wield enormous influence through economic ties, military bases, and international institutions. But here's the thing, and this is important: Africa isn't just a victim of history. Despite everything thrown at it, the continent is rising. African writers, artists, entrepreneurs, and leaders are reclaiming their narratives, building new systems, and connecting with each other in ways that transcend those colonial borders. There's a growing movement to teach African history from African perspectives, not just through the lens of colonization. Technology is allowing African innovators to leapfrog old development models. And there's an increasing demand for former colonial powers to acknowledge the harm they caused and make meaningful amends. The Berlin Conference of 1884 was one of history's most consequential meetings, not because it was particularly dramatic, no battles were fought, no revolutions erupted, but because it set in motion a chain of events that fundamentally altered the trajectory of an entire continent and the lives of hundreds of millions of people. It's a stark reminder that decisions made in rooms of power by people who face no consequences for those decisions can have devastating impacts on those who weren't even consulted. So here's what I want you to do. First, if you found this story as mind-blowing as I did when I first learned about it, hit that subscribe button, because we're diving into more hidden history that they definitely didn't teach you in school. Second, drop a comment below. What surprised you most about the Berlin Conference? Did you know about this before today? And what other historical events should we uncover on this channel? Your comments literally shape what we talk about next. And finally, share this video with someone who loves history or someone who needs to understand why studying history matters. Because the Berlin Conference isn't just about the past, it's about understanding how the past shapes our present and how we can build a better future by learning from these mistakes. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.